controversy. Thank you. This talk is about current controversies in causal inference. And in fact, I'm going to use examples from several different areas of epidemiology, not just occupational epidemiology, but the controversies, because they're about generic methods, they apply right throughout the field of epidemiology, including occupational. The issues I'm talking about, there's a good set of debates and papers in the December 2016 issue of the International Journal of Epidemiology. So if you can get access to that issue, either in hard copy or online, it really gives a good, it shows the range of views and shows you what some of the debates are about. So in this session, I'll start by talking about what is a cause, and then types of causes, how we assess causality, old debates about causality, and current debates about causality. So what is a cause? If you've been to Edinburgh, in the main street there, the Royal Mile, you'll see a statue of David Hume, who wrote an inquiry concerning human understanding in 1748. And of course, people have written a lot about causality before him and since, but his work really has remained definitive. And he defines a cause in that book. He says we may define a cause to be an object followed by another, where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. So basically, if one thing always follows another, then it's said to be caused by the action or event that happened first. And this is basically the theory of induction, which dominated science really for at least 200 years or more, so after 1748. But then in the next sentence, he says a completely different definition. And he says, or in other words, but actually it's quite a different idea. If the first object had not been, the second had never existed. And this is the theory of counterfactuals, which has really become very popular in all areas of science in the last 30 or 40 years. So these are actually two completely opposite ideas of what a cause is, though Hume proposed both of them and didn't realize that there was a difference between them. So the point is that, so in epidemiology, the theory of counterfactuals, like Hume said, is that we may define a cause to be an object followed by another, whereas if the first object had not been, the second had not existed. So that's counterfactuals. In epidemiology, one of the earliest textbooks, McMahon and Pew, said an association may be classed as presumptively causal when it is believed that had the cause been altered, the effect would have changed. And once again, these are two different things. The first one just says if the exposure had not occurred, then the disease would not have occurred, for example. Or certainly if the action or event had not happened, then the consequence of it would not have happened. But McMahon and Pew doesn't just say that the exposure is if the exposure had not been, it said had the exposure been altered. And that's a concept that comes from randomized controlled trials. So the first definition assumes that the exposure is present or not present, but does not say how this occurs. It just says we want to contrast these two situations. The second definition assumes that the exposure has somehow been altered, that someone has actually intervened and done something, which is what we do in randomized trials. And it's the difference between these two ideas about cause that are fundamental to the current debates in epidemiology. So types of causes. Here's a common example from genetics. So in most parts of the world, when babies are born, there's a finger prick test, and they get tested for phenylketonuria. And you need two things to happen to get phenylketonuria. you need to have the PKU gene, and you need to have a high phenylalanine diet. And it's only if you have both of those, you get the disease or condition known as phenylketonuria. So if you have both of those things, you have 100% risk. If you only have one of them or you have neither, you have no risk of getting PKU. So is phenylketonuria a genetic disease or an environmental disease? Well, if you think back to Hume's definition, that if the first object had not been, the second had never existed. So if these people didn't have the PKU gene, or we did some sort of intervention to change it, we might be able to do one day, how many cases of PKU would be prevented? Well, 100%, all of them, because if they had not had the gene, they wouldn't be in this box, they would be in this box. So their risk goes from 100% to 0%. So 100% of the cases are caused by genetic factors. On the other hand, suppose instead of being on a high phenylalanine diet, they'd been on a low phenylalanine diet, what percentage of cases would have been prevented? Once again, it's 100%. If you move from this box to this box, you prevent all the cases. So you can, 100% of the cases are due to genetics and 100% are due to diet. And the point is the percentages don't have to add up to 100%. In this case, they add up to 200% because it's the combination of factors that produces the disease. And this idea that's still prevalent in genetics, that you can partition a disease and say it's 30% genetic and 70% environmental, that's complete rubbish. Almost every disease is 100% genetic and 100% environmental. It almost always includes combinations of genetic factors and environmental exposures. The other interesting thing about these two causes, one is a state, that is, you have the PKU gene, and one is an action. You have to do something. You eat food high in phenylalanine. Now, it turns out almost everyone on the planet has a high phenylalanine diet, and we can't actually change the gene. So the reason they test the babies is that if they are susceptible to PKU, they just put them on a low phenylalanine diet. So it's actually the environmental exposure that we intervene on, even though it's 100% genetic and 100% environmental. But in the context of this talk, it's also important to note that one of these causes is a state and one is an action. What if the state had been something that might change over time? And here's an example where the two exposures are obesity and high-risk lifestyle. I won't define what that is, but here it's no longer 100% versus 000. But basically, if you have a high BMI and you have other risk factors for diabetes, you have a high risk of diabetes. If you have a low BMI and a healthy lifestyle, you have a low risk of diabetes. So all four boxes can get diabetes, but the risk is different between these different groups. So some cases occur in the low risk people, some occur because of lifestyle, some occur because of diabetes, and some occur because of the combination. So all of these things are causes, but there are differences between them. So there are some causes that in theory we could randomize, like we could randomize smoking or asbestos exposure in theory, and some that we could not randomize. You can't randomize sex. You can't randomize obesity. You can't randomly allocate one group of people to have a high BMI and another group of people to have a low BMI. And there are also some causes that we can intervene on and alter, like we can do smoking prevention, or we can do interventions to reduce obesity, and some we can't, such as sex. So this gives us three main types of causes. There's causes that we could in theory randomize, so it involves some sort of action. There's some which is not possible to analyze, like obesity, but maybe we can do interventions to change them. We can't randomize them, but we can change them. So they're dynamic states. And there's some things that are just fixed, which are fixed states. And here's a few examples of them. So fixed states would include things like sex, and genetics. The dynamic states are things like gender, because that's partly a matter of self-identification and ethnicity, DNA methylation, so epigenetics, obesity, high cholesterol, high blood pressure. And then there's actions like smoking, racism, gene therapy, exercise, diet, and so on. So it's only these things that are actions that we can do randomized controlled trials for. And one of the reasons that I'm going on about this point is that some of the current theories of causality in epidemiology basically argue that you can only prove causality with a randomized controlled trial or an epidemiologic study that very closely mimics an RCT. And there's a number of problems with that point of view, but one of them is it restricts causes to the types of cause that are in this column. So you have prominent epidemiologists, for example, writing papers saying obesity is not a cause because you can't randomize obesity, you can't do a randomized trial. You can do a randomized trial of something like exercise that may reduce obesity, but that's not the same thing as randomizing the state itself. So there's what we argue in some of the papers I've referred to is that there's all of these things are causes, and they all fit in with this idea of counterfactuals, which came from David Hume. How do we assess causality? There's two main approaches that are, that are different sides of the argument these days. But one says you do one really good study, like a perfect randomized controlled trial, and just focus on that. The other approach, which I favor, is to consider all of the evidence together. So you have a pluralistic approach, you have a whole variety of study designs, you might apply them in different populations. I'll talk about triangulation a little bit later. And also, if you can understand the mechanisms, that gives you much stronger evidence about causality. So it's important to emphasize that even a randomized trial cannot establish causality on its own, because it always relies on auxiliary assumptions or evidence, like it was unbiased participation, there was no misclassification, that the comparison group, that was not contaminated, they did not adopt the intervention as well. And this applies in all science, that any theory always relies on auxiliary hypotheses. So you can only say that a trial has established causality if you're prepared to assume a whole bunch of background factors. In terms of putting the evidence together, there's really nothing better been written since Bradford Hill's article in 1965. And he has a whole 9 viewpoints. People sometimes call them criteria, but he emphasizes that none of them are essential. They're just different ways you should look at the data and think about it. And he says, what I do not believe, and this has been suggested, is that we can usefully lay down some hard and fast rules of evidence that must be obeyed before we can accept cause and effect. None of my 9 viewpoints can bring indisputable evidence for or against the cause and effect hypothesis, and none of them can be required. What they can do with greater or lesser strength is to help us make up our minds on the fundamental question: is there any other way of explaining the set of facts before us? Is there any other answer equally or more likely than cause and effect? And like I said, that was published in 1965, and really, no one has really published anything better since then, I believe. There've been a few developments since then. I'd list 3. One is the idea of ruling out alternatives. The second is interlocking arguments from different areas of science, so as the IAC monographs do. And the third is the idea of triangulation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the other 2 later. But one example of ruling out alternatives is that when the first study of smoking and lung cancer was 1931, but the key studies were published in the early 1950s. And at the time, Fisher, who was the leading statistician of the 20th century, didn't believe it because there had been no randomized controlled trial of smoking and lung cancer. And he said that, well, maybe there's a gene that causes you to smoke and causes you to get lung cancer. And people took that seriously for 30 or 40 years. But in fact, it could be ruled out immediately just by the time trend data, because if genes don't change in the population very fast. So if that was true, that gene would have always been around and lung cancer would have always been high. But in fact, what you see is that people started smoking a lot, particularly after the First World War, because they gave cigarettes to the soldiers. And 20 years later, lung cancer started to go up. So that can't be genetic. And so you can actually refute that hypothesis just by the time trend data. And you've probably been told many times that time trend data are not very reliable. But in this case, they provided the best evidence right away that this alternative hypothesis was wrong. Despite that, people argued about it for 30 or 40 years. In terms of putting the evidence together, I think a good sort of complementary exercise to Bradford Hill is what the IARC monographs do. And that Bradford Hill was 1965 and the IARC monographs were 1971. And so this is, Michelle's involved in one of these at the moment, but I've been involved in a few, and you review the evidence on cancer in humans. A separate group reviews the evidence on cancer in experimental animals, and a third group reviews the mechanistic and other relevant data and puts them together to come up with this IARC classification. And the point is, even if you had a randomized controlled trial in humans, you almost always don't for something that causes cancer, you would still consider that alongside what you know from animal studies and what we know about mechanisms. So it's really the combination of these different types of data from different sources that helps us reach conclusions about causality. So old debates. I've been involved in epidemiology since 1980, and every decade the same debate happens over and over again. You get people saying you can't prove causality without randomized controlled trials. Now, even by 1980, we'd proven that smoking causes lung cancer. We'd proven that asbestos causes lung cancer. There's never been a randomized controlled trial of either of those. That was proven by essentially putting all of the evidence together in the way that IARC does. But still, we keep having these old debates in new forms with people saying you can only prove causality with randomized controlled trials, and that observational studies are inevitably crippled by confounding and other biases. But there's a lot of limitations of randomized controlled trials. Firstly, only certain questions get asked. So states like sex and obesity, you can't randomize, so you can't do a RCT. There's actions like climate change or smoking, which are impossible or difficult to randomize. To do a randomized trial of climate change, we'd need 2 planets. We only have 1. Often very simplistic questions get asked, or often the intervention doesn't work, so it's not applied properly, or there is a spillover to the non-intervention group. And here's an example of this. These are the biggest and best studies of mortality from coronary heart disease. And they involved multiple risk factor interventions. So the participants in one group were basically told to stop smoking, exercise more, eat more healthily, and have less salt. And in some cases, they might be given antihypertensives or statins. And a relative risk of 1 is represented by this line. So if the intervention was beneficial, the point estimate would be to the left of the line, because the intervention group would have a lower CHD mortality than the comparison group that didn't have the intervention. And like I said, these are the biggest and best studies ever done. And if you put them all together, you get an odds ratio of 0.96 with confidence intervals, including 1. You actually see no benefit from, and like I said, these are the biggest and best studies that have ever been done. And it doesn't mean that smoking and diet and exercise don't affect your health. It just means it's very hard to show them in a trial. And what you see in most of these trials is a lot of the intervention group don't follow the intervention. And a lot of the comparison group do, because people stop smoking or start exercising for lots of different reasons, not just because we tell them to, because we're doing a trial. So in fact, there's no good evidence from RCTs that these sort of interventions work. but we know from observational studies that these factors are very important. Related to that, we have this false hierarchy of study designs. So a lot of people would say RCTs are the top, and then there's modern causal inference methods and Mendelian randomization, and then cohort studies, then case control studies, then cross-sectional studies, and then ecologic studies. I happen to support Chelsea in the football, and my partner supports Bradford. And Chelsea is currently top of the Premier League, and Bradford City is in the Division 2, but that's actually the fourth level. So there's about 70 places different. But a couple of years ago, we saw Bradford beat Chelsea at Chelsea. And the point is that, sure, if you've got a Premier League team playing a team in Division 2, most of the time you would expect the Premier League team to win, but it doesn't always. Sometimes the lower level team will win. And the same here, that on the average, in general, you would expect RCTs to provide better information, but that's only on the average. There's a lot of situations where you can't do one, or they don't work, you can't provide good information, whereas information from observational studies may actually be much better. And one example of that is the example I gave on time trends in smoking and lung cancer, which comes under ecologic studies. They're ranked very low in most scoring systems, but for that particular issue, that was the best evidence by far. So this false hierarchy of study designs, none of these designs provides definitive evidence, all depend on auxiliary information. Causal inference always involves putting all of the evidence together. On the average, a Premier League team will defeat a lower league team, but there are important exceptions, and many questions cannot be tested in RCTs or in observational studies that look like RCTs, and other study designs can provide key information. So current debates. The old version is that you can only prove causality with RCTs. The new version is that you can only prove causality with RCTs and with observational studies that using modern causal inference methods that essentially analyze them to make them very similar to the corresponding RCT. And the most extreme version of that is some of the algorithms that are now quite widely used. GRADE is very widely used, for example, by it's used by WHO to assess air pollution data. Robin's Eye is a similar tool for assessing risk of bias in non-randomized studies. Robin's Eye is for interventions, but Robin Z is for exposures. And these algorithms are becoming very widely used. And typically what happens if you want to decide, does formaldehyde cause bladder cancer, say, you'll get all the evidence together and they'll use these algorithms to score the individual studies, and they'll throw away all the ones with low scores. And usually what you're left with is a couple of, you might have an RCT, or often they end up throwing all the evidence away. And because they only consider evidence that comes from RCTs or something very close to a randomized controlled trial to be worthwhile. And all of the other types of studies that we do in epidemiology get scored low and essentially don't get used in the evaluations. So what does this mean in practice? The good aspects are more explicit formulation of the counterfactual contrast. In some instances, it's quite useful to design an epidemiological study to mimic as closely as possible what the results, what would have been obtained from the corresponding RCT. And in some cases, if you're studying actions, it gives you a better understanding of epidemiological theory and practice. On the downside, it restricts epidemiology to studying causes which fit this paradigm. And so you have people saying you can't estimate the causal effect of obesity. And the worst instance is this idea of scoring studies to see how closely they mimic an RCT, and rejection of studies with low scores. In many ways, this is a rerun of the old debate about RCTs versus observational studies. And it has major problems, particularly exclusion and or neglect of other causes, which are states, even though some of these are clinically important. For example, clinicians, the main risk factors that patients have, they're obese, they have high cholesterol, they have high blood pressure. They're all states which can't be randomized. And also, you can't also, according to that theory, produce causal estimates for fixed states such as sex. And it fits in with the idea that causality can only be established with a single perfect study, and we should always strive to do such a study rather than taking a more comprehensive triangulation approach. And it neglects or eliminates many of the things that make epidemiology unique and important, in other words, the population perspective. Here's one example from a couple of years ago. IARC did a classification of red meat, and it decided that processed red meat, like sausages and salami, they put into category 1, sufficient evidence, and red meat in general, I think it went into 2A. And there was a group of international experts which were got together. It turned out, and eventually some of them had some funding from the meat industry, but that's another story. But essentially what they did was get all the epidemiological evidence alone. So they didn't consider the mechanistic and animal evidence. And then they scored them using grade, and they threw out all of the observational evidence. None of it scored very well. And they had either 1 or 2 randomized controlled trials, which were not the right intervention because they were general lifestyle interventions rather than interventions just on meat. They weren't very big, and they didn't follow people for very long. And not surprisingly, they found no benefit of the intervention. So this group then concluded that IARC had got it wrong, and that there was no evidence that red meat increased the risk of cancer. The same thing's been happening in the air pollution field. This was under Trump. I think it's changing now, but this was the chair of the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee, which said that rather than relying on the weight of evidence approach that the EPA has traditionally used in infer causation, the committee wants to rely on studies that use manipulative causality. This theory restricts epidemiologic evidence that may be considered acceptable to assess causality to results from intervention studies or studies that have been analysed with the use of causal inference statistical methods. So this was in the New England Journal of Medicine 2019, and the Trump administration was moving to essentially throw out all of the epidemiologic evidence and to ease the standards for air pollution. Another argument that I frequently hear is that there's no alternative. The causal inference theory is based around RCTs, and what's the alternative for proving causality? In fact, the alternative is what we've been doing for the last 200 years. We established things like smoking as the cause of lung cancer, not by doing RCTs, but by reviewing all the evidence using approaches like that of Bradford Hill and IARC. And these traditional methods can be improved on by some recent developments, but it's really Bradford Hill remains the core of what we do. And as I said, we did manage to establish causality, e.g. smoking and lung cancer, prior to modern causal inference methods and without requiring RCTs. So what should we do or teach instead? We should teach that epidemiology is the science of the distribution and determinants of disease in human populations. Discovering a cause usually involves a complex process with a wide variety of evidence. And causal inference, once you've done the studies, also involves a wide variety of evidence. There is no best study design, and really is there a single definitive study, but traditional methods can be improved on or supplemented, but not replaced by more recent methodological developments. Now, I will show you 2 other slides, which I'm sorry I'd forgotten. We're not in this pack. Just before I finish, because I want to focus on 2 particular papers that I think add to this debate. Actually, I think I know where it is. Just a minute. Okay, so I'd refer you in addition to two particular papers that I think take a very nice approach. One is by Deborah Lawler and others on triangulation. And what that says is triangulation is the practice of obtaining more reliable answers to research questions through integrating results from several different approaches, where each approach has different key sources of potential bias that are unrelated to each other. And there's an emphasis on the importance of being explicit about the expected direction of bias with each approach whenever this is possible, and seeking to identify approaches that would be expected to bias the true causal effect in different directions. So for example, for my PhD back in the 1980s, I did a case control study of pesticides and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And of course, patients with cancer may think a lot about what exposures they've had and what, and they may remember that someone sprayed pesticides behind their garden, 20 years ago. Whereas a healthy control may not have gone through the same thought process. But so essentially what I did, I had cases of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and I had two control groups. One was a general population control group, and one was a control group of patients with other types of cancer, which we believe were not caused by pesticides. And when you thought it through, both of them were not perfect, but if there was a bias, it would be in opposite directions and you would get different answers with the two control groups. And in fact, we got the same answers with both. So that was very reassuring that these sorts of biases were not occurring. So that's one example of triangulation. Other examples would be where you deliberately choose populations where the confounding structure might be different. For example, occupational exposures to pesticides might occur in quite a different context in a low and middle income country than in a high income country. So if you can get similar results in both places, then that's quite powerful. The second paper I'd refer you to is this one by David Savitz, who says that mechanistic risk of bias assessments focus on assessing whether specific biases are present, but fail to provide insights into the direction, magnitude, and relative importance of individual biases. David Savitz argues that instead, risk of bias assessments should focus on identifying a small number of the most likely influential sources of bias, classifying each study based on how effectively it has addressed each potential bias, and determining whether results differ across studies in relation to susceptibility to the hypothesized source of bias. An example of that would be, suppose you're doing a study of some occupational study of cause of lung cancer. You'd be concerned about confounding by smoking. So and some studies will have smoking data and some won't. Often the cohort studies based on personnel records will not have smoking data, but the case control studies will have smoking data. So what you can do is think, well, out of all these studies, which are the ones that can best assess whether what we see is due to confounding by smoking? And maybe you've got some case control studies with very good smoking data. And if you find that adjustment for smoking didn't change the results for those studies, that's quite reassuring. The problem at the moment is that when committees use things like grade and Robbins, instead the cohort study they would reject or score very low because it has no smoking data. And the case control study they would score very low because it's a case control study and they believe in this hierarchy of study designs. So both of them would get rejected, both sets of studies. But actually, if you put them together, they can be very powerful. So that's the idea of triangulation and of the Bradford Hill approach. So that's, I've finished, but I think we have 9 minutes. We don't have to use it all, but does anyone have any comments or questions? I have a few in the chat. Yeah, Erdem?
Okay, thank you. Hello.
Yeah.
I